Hello watch lovers, thanks for coming along on another discovery of a vintage watch. My name is Stian and today we have a 1964 IWC caliber 89 on the bench. We can see the watch is in a really nice condition. It's a small crack in the crystal, but the dial is in very good condition and the case as well. It does run. Not entirely sure how well it runs yet. We'll see that in a second. But overall it looks very nice. That is the original crown. It should not have a fish crown. And yes, it does run, but not that well. So there is work to do. The case back is really tight. So in order to avoid any damage, I use this little tool I have. And wow, look at that. That looks untouched. And this is a nearly 60-year-old watch. And typically in those days, watchmakers would engrave their markings after servicing a watch inside the case back. But there are no markings there either. While the movement could be untouched, there are some marks in the opening slots between the case and the bezel and the case back. So those have been removed. And there are some tiny marks around the setting lever screw. But that could be without servicing the watch, so we'll see. Let's get the hands and the dial off. And in these old watches, there are two main ways of making parts stay together. It's either by press fitting, so that the part is so small that it barely fits on when you press it on, so friction. And the other is by screws. So we take the hands off the dial from the friction fit, and then we unscrew the dial itself from the movement with the small screws. Oh wow, that's a nice color play there with a blued hairspring and the red jewels with the golden settings. Yeah, it's not a bad job being a watchmaker. So what I did was let the power down from the mainspring so that we can start taking the parts off the main plate without any risk of destroying any parts or making them ping off. Now I'm just having a look at the hairspring and also the pivots on the balance, and they look good. So this movement will not be seen by anyone. It will only be seen by watchmakers and maybe the owner if they try to take the case back off. But still, we want to make sure that we don't leave any marks. So that's why we need to make sure that our screwdrivers are sharp, that we use the right size screwdriver and so forth. Otherwise we will slip with the screwdriver, we will leave marks around the screws and so forth, and with this kind of beauty you really don't want to do that. That little click you hear sometimes when I unscrew a screw is just telling us that the screw is completely unscrewed. I told you before that I looked at the balance to see if the pivots were okay. And those pivots on the balance are the tiniest in the watch. So they have this special protection that we're taking out here. It's beautiful red jewels, rubies. And they're held in place by these tiny gold-colored springs. And after we disassembled pretty much everything, we use some pegwood in these jewel holes in the oil sinks, just to make sure that any old cruddy oil is removed before we put the parts into the cleaning machine. Now the barrel actually does show some marks, and that's interesting. We haven't really seen any marks on the movement until now. And the mainspring does seem to be a bit newer than the rest of the watch. They did start making this S-shaped mainspring in the mid-1960s, but I do believe this one is newer than the watch itself. So something has been done. And we see some very old dried up lubrication inside the barrel. There is a little bit of wear, but it's only cosmetic in the plating, so it doesn't affect the mainspring itself. Last thing we're going to do then, before putting the parts into the cleaning machine, is to polish, or rather clean, the pivots a little bit. So the pivots are the ends of these pins that go through the wheels. And it's important that they're very clean, very shiny, if you will, because that means there's little friction. And friction is a real killer for watches. The underside of the ratchet wheel here is the only part that shows any kind of corrosion or anything like that. That's okay. After 60 years, we'll give you that IWC. All right, all the parts are laid out, ready to go into the cleaning machine. So let's go for that. The cleaning machine goes back and forth very quickly. So it doesn't rotate round and round. And the reason it does that is because then the parts will more or less stay put. They won't have time to move anywhere. But the liquid will wash back and forth over them. So it's quite gentle for the parts. All right, with the parts cleaned, we're going to put some of the parts into something we call fix-or-drop. And what fix-or-drop does is leave a very thin film on the surface of the parts. And that film stops lubrication from creeping so that it stays in place. Now this fix-or-drop liquid, it evaporates faster than New Year's resolutions on January 2nd. So that's why we use this hourglass-shaped bottle for it. And apparently this bottle is made from pure diamond. Well, at least think so when you know that the price can get up to a couple of $100 or euros of what you have. Because fix-or-drops leaves this membrane on every surface, we're going to put the pivots into some pithwood to clean those, so we don't get any residue into the movement. And we're going to put a tiny little drop of thin oil onto the capstones. That is where the pivots of the balance staff will, pivot. So these little drops help really minimize the friction as the balance oscillates back and forth. And the balance is really the beating heart of mechanical watch movement. If the balance doesn't oscillate freely, then the watch will never run well. And consequently, it's also important that the top and bottom pivots both run at, let's say, the same rate. Otherwise, the watch would run differently depending on what position you hold your arm in. All right, let's see then if the balance oscillates freely. Yeah, that looks just nice. Beautiful play of the colors there. All right, let's then get to the rest of the movement. We're first going to put the mainspring back into the barrel. Put a little bit of grease at the bottom of the barrel before we put the mainspring in. That grease will then spread along the different coils of the mainspring as the watch runs. And then we're using this mainspring winder to get the mainspring coiled up. A little problem here with this mainspring is that the end of it is what they call T-shaped. So it doesn't really fit into that little slot, that little cutout in the mainspring winder there. So we have to gently open up a little bit to allow it to come in. There. And there's the mainspring, ready to be inserted into the barrel. It's also a little bit of an issue to get that T-shaped end into the proper slot in the barrel. So that can be a bit fiddly. With the barrel arbor in place, we put a little bit of oil on the friction points there. And then we can put the barrel lid back on. We have to align one of those openings with that T end on the mainspring. You don't really see those T-ended mainsprings much anymore. There's not really any need for them, to be honest. The mainsprings will stay in the barrel without that double security feature of the T-end. But it does seem to be that the watch has been serviced. Interesting that there are no marks in the case back. That was completely common back in the old days, that you put your mark in the case back after servicing a watch. Nowadays that's frowned upon by most watchmakers. It's just not necessary to make any deliberate marks in any part of a watch. But whoever serviced that watch then really did a good job of making sure there were no marks after his or her work. That is indeed how it should be. But much too often we do see quite a few marks. Of course, if a watch is serviced, let's say 10 times, there will be some marks. Upon close scrutiny, we can see that the screws have been unscrewed and tightened and so forth before, because there is slight pressure marks on the sides of the screw slot, but you don't really see them with the naked eye. So well done to whoever did this. Oh man, I'm wheezing like a whale here. Still have a bit of a cold. I'm not sure my voice is still sexy, but I will ask my wife tonight. So this is, of course, mass-produced movement and mass-produced watch. This specific reference isn't that common, but the calibrate denied movement, which is very famous to watch geeks, was made in several 100,000 copies. But man, if you can mass produce something this beautiful, then go ahead, man, make all you can. See, there's a little bit of wear there on the base for the crown wheel. Not enough to really make us worried. This screw here with those parallel grooves in the top is left-handed thread. So reverse of what is normal. And if you wonder why it's called left-handed or right-handed for that sake, right-handed is the normal way of threading screws. So if you stretch your arm out, make a fist, turn your thumb up, then if you screw in the direction your fingers point, the screw itself will move in the direction your thumb points. And then of course the other way for left-handed thread. So that's why they call it right-handed and left-handed. We'll put a tiny little amount of thicker oil on these friction points, the pivot posts and so forth. And also here between that spring on the yoke and the yoke itself. And then we use this special grease for the cannon pinion, which we can see is friction fit. And the reason it recoils a little bit when we touch it is that the click spring on the other side makes the barrel recoil ever so slightly when we move it. And if you want to learn a little bit more about how these different parts actually make the watch work, you can watch a video I made on that. Just click up in the right corner. There is a clear logic to how it's made, so that's how I approach it in that video. Alright, with the winding and time setting working as it should, we can turn the watch over again. We're going to put in this seconds pinion. It's held in place with that little spring that we're putting on top here. It's just a little brass stick basically. And what that spring does, it puts a little bit of tension on the seconds pinion so that the seconds hand, which is then directly press fit onto that second pinion, does not stutter. So it rotates, let's say, uniformly around the dial. There was also a question that I noticed in the comment field for another video. How come the hands on some watches move smoothly across the dial and other watches move, let's say, less smoothly? And the reason is the beat rate of a watch. An old watch like this has a beat rate of 18,000 beats per hour. And that's basically 18,000 ticks and tocks per hour. And if you break that down, that means 5 ticks and tocks per second. So the seconds hand will move 5 times per second, which makes it seem less than smooth when you really look at it. While newer watches can be twice that. And of course, Seiko's spring drive is completely smooth. While I was talking about that, we've been lubricating the pallets. You can see I really made a mess of that exit pallet, so I'm going to take the pallet fork out and clean it. But first I'm gonna distribute the lubrication onto the escape wheel teeth. And then we can put the balance in. We need to get the bottom pivot into that little tiny hole. Come on, you can do it. Yeah, there it is. Then if we have aligned the top and bottom pivots, the balance should start oscillating. And if it does need some help, that might be an indication of the beat error being too high. And you might remember seeing that the beat error was indeed very high in the before test on the time grapher. Anyway, let's give the watch a wind and then put some oil into the oil sinks. This again is of course to reduce the friction. And then we can move to demagnetize the watch. Before we then put it on the time grapher. On a time grapher you can normally set the lift angle. That doesn't impact the timekeeping of the watch, but it does impact the amplitude. Now the lines look pretty okay, but if we look at the beat error, it's 5.0 milliseconds, which is a little bit too much. So the balance will rotate first in one direction, then the other. And if it takes longer to rotate in one direction than the other, it shows up here as a higher than 0 number. And the problem with that is that the watch will not run as well as it should. And it also will be a little bit more reluctant to start, as we saw. Now the time grapher only tells us that the left and right oscillations are not of the same length, but it doesn't tell us which one is longer than the other. So to find that out, we're going to slow the watch down until it completely stops. And that metal bar you see at the bottom of the picture is the pallet fork going left and right. And it might be possible to see that it tilts a little bit to the right. And when the watch completely stops, yeah, come on then, you can stop now. It's possible to see that it's a little bit skewed to the right. And although 5 milliseconds is really not a lot of time, it's still more than it should be. We should try to have less than 1 millisecond difference between left and right oscillations. So these old watches don't have a simple way of regulating the beat error. So we're going to have to take the balance off the balance cock. And then we're going to have to move this collet that holds the hairspring onto the balance staff ever so slightly. Might have to do this a couple of times. I had to do it twice. And for those of you into the whole watch repair trade, you can see that this is a Breguet overcoil hairspring. And it's got this interesting way of holding the hairspring stud. So that little plate with those two screws are removed is just for holding the hairspring. It's not for regulating anything. And those screws are tiny. It's difficult to get a good shot of it, while I'm also trying not to slip and make any scratches or marks. And with that intervention, we do see that the beat error comes down to a good rate. And this looks just fine. We're going to be happy with this. And with the movement ticking and tocking away happily, we can put the dial and the hands on. I did clean the hands a little bit, but they are in very good condition anyway. Again, the hands are friction fit, so pressed onto the wheels. We need to make sure they're properly seated and that they do not touch the dial, that they are parallel to the dial. And then we can put the minute hand on. And you might remember that the long hand should point up when the short hand points to one of the hours. So that's what we're trying to do here. And lastly, the seconds hand. And look at that. We made a quartz watch out of this IWC. Tick, tock, tick, tock. No, it should not move like that. But that's a concern for another day. Let's first make sure that the hands are parallel, do not touch each other. And when I said that we'll deal with the watch having turned into quartz another day, I didn't really mean another day, but let's case the watch first and we can deal with it. So the watch is ready to be cased, so let's go ahead and clean the case and get it ready. We'll first just take the old crystal out because it was a little bit cracked anyway. Crystal is also a press fit into the bezel. Alright, pro tip coming up. Cover your ears. This is the worst sound known to mankind. So let's get a new crystal. We're going to press this crystal into the bezel. So we put the bezel around this little rubber anvil. And then when we press this die on top of that anvil, then the crystal will bend a little bit around it. Just enough to fit the bezel onto the crystal. Or the other way around if you prefer. There we are. And with that we can case the movement. Before putting the case back and the bezel firmly on, we're going to adjust that quartz movement like seconds hand. And that's easy to adjust on these movements. We just tighten that little brass spring on the seconds pinion.
Papa? Someone in Espen's class, Espen's handball team, called Nina, and she's so mean.
She's mean?
Yeah.
Why?
She said to the whole team, and I think there's a teacher inside the team, and I think there's a teacher inside Espen's team,
Yeah.
and she said to the team, they're terrible at doing handball.
She said that to the team?
Yeah, but she's actually the one that's terrible at the handball.
Oh yeah.
Cause she just stands in the middle of the field and says, "Give me the ball," and then there's people that takes her.
Oh, okay. Sounds like Mean Girls Part 2 is taking place in my kid's school. Anyway, before we see the watch on the wrist, I just want to remind everyone that on vintagewatchservices.eu You'll always find more than 100 beautiful vintage watches. And of course, as a YouTube subscriber, you get 10% off. So check it out. And there it is. This beautiful IWC caliber 89. Pretty much untouched, especially on the inside, but likely someone has serviced it once before. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then clicking like and subscribe will really help the channel, so please do that. We'll be back shortly with another restoration video. Until then, ta-ta.